So greetings, comrades. Welcome to the final installment of the 2025 Socialism Speaker Series. Tonight's panel will be Envisioning a Post-Capitalist Future. Stay tuned for the 2026 Socialist Speakers lineup. This presentation is being recorded by Missoula Community Access Television as part of a media assistance grant donated to Western Montana DSA and provided by MCAT. And I also want to know that we now have an archive of the 2025 Socialist Speaker Series on our website. So if you go to westernmtdsa.org and look under the resources menu, you should find it. So this evening, I will present a partial indictment of capitalism. These good people of the jury will give their verdicts as a kind of restorative justice. They will suggest what can be done and what a socialist future can look like. Our panelists this evening are Mark Anderlich, who will talk about labor and its relationship to socialism, as well as talking about foreign relations. Dave Quattrucci on the end will be talking about healthcare. Justice York in the middle will be talking about the environment, and Josh Decker, second from the end, will be talking about housing, and Celia Winkler, right next to me, will talk about kinship and comradeship. Each speaker will talk for about 15 minutes, and when all are done, we'll have a Q&A and a lively and respectful conversation. Please hold your questions until the end. So, to start with, let me pose a question to you, the audience. To you, the audience, our People's Court, assembled here tonight. Why do landlords increase rents as high as possible? And why do oil companies destroy the climate? And why do corporations buy governments to do their bidding? Any answers? Just shout out. Okay, I'm hearing a lot of answers, and they all sound right. Money, greed, profit, and so forth. But I would say that the simple answer is because they can. They do it because they can. And that sounds a little bit flip, but it's really vernacular for how a system of political economy really works. Every political economic system defines what it allows, what it prevents, and what it rewards. If you think about it, this frame flips how things are, how we often look at it. It's not necessarily that greedy CEOs can do anything they can for profit. That's the liberal way of seeing the world. It's that our system encourages them to be socially and environmentally destructive and irresponsible. Profit is the encouragement the system uses to make companies and individuals behave antisocially. If it were just greed or other individual character flaws that drive our economic ills, we could conceivably just throw the bastards out and achieve a better world. But if we flip that frame around and understand that it's the system that is malignant and not the people who work in it, we come to a socialist point of view. And that's what we're here for tonight. So why do corporations extract as much from labor as possible from their workers while paying them as little as possible? Because they can. Why do health insurance companies profit from denying people access to health care? Because they can. Why do oil companies, manufacturing companies, and mining companies pollute the environment? Because they can. Do you see a pattern here? We have a system that not only allows them to do these things, but rewards them for doing so. That system is called capitalism. If we are fighting in each of these arenas as if they were unrelated, we find ourselves perennially playing whack-a-mole and mostly losing. Are most landlords greedy and selfish? Probably not. Are most CEOs venal narcissists? Some are, but most are not. Are most bosses assholes? No, only when they have power over you. They're just doing what the system allows them to do, encourages them to do, and sometimes punishes them for not doing. Why don't our allegedly democratic institutions prevent them from exploitation? Why can't we just enact better laws? Because these same interests have the power to bend government to their will. Why do they do it? Because they can. You all get red stars. Why don't people take over and vanquish these ganefs? It's tempting to say because we can't, but that would not be true. We are the many. We are the 99%. We are the working class, and we can take power. We can take their power, and we have to take their power. To do so requires a vision of what we are striving for. It's not enough to just enumerate the crimes of capitalism, and there are many. We need to envision what a post-capitalist world can look like. We need a dream to follow. There's much more that we could say in this indictment, but you get the point. So the prosecution rests. Well, actually, we must never rest in the prosecution of capitalism and our quest for a better world. And now, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I turn the case over to you. Share with the People's Court assembled here your visions of the future in the various arenas of expertise. Show us what a socialist restorative justice will actually look like. So to start with, we will, let me introduce Mark Anderlich again. He will speak on labor and its relationship to socialism. Mark is a longtime union and community organizer, former president of Missoula Area Central Labor Council, AFL-CIO, and an organizer for nuclear disarmament and against war since the 1970s. Mark has been a DSA member since 2017, and in addition to being co-chair for 2 years, he has worked on housing, peace, labor, and electoral issues. Mark.
All right. You are so kind. You can hear me, right? Okay. So these remarks, I'm going to be doing some work on foreign policy later on, but in keeping with the democratic spirit of socialism, my comments are my own and are offered tonight as my vision of what socialism could look like. Of course, how a world without capitalism will actually look like is up to the democratic process that you and your co-citizens here will work out in the future. To prepare for a post-capitalist future, you need to develop your own views and work with others to shape those views into concrete plans of collective action. It is, and I'm going to go just a real general introduction of some terms and what socialism is. It is supremely important to understand that socialism is a process with no expiration date. The creativity and vision of socialism means that there is no final destination, only the give and take of lived experiences that correct mistakes and improve on the actual practice to meet up with its lofty goals. Some of those central goals are ones already widely shared: the democratic control of the economy, which is probably the most essential definition of socialism, but also the democratic control of the government, robust human rights, an end to poverty, an end to economic exploitation, racism, sexism, and other practices of oppression, relations with other peoples and nations that support democratic self-determination, an economy that is sustainable with our planet. In other words, the goal of socialism is to create the conditions where every individual can live a good and decent life and realize their full potential as human beings. That's the goal. When socialism approaches reaching these goals, it is a matter of being human that new forms of violence and domination may emerge. Bureaucratization, social hierarchies, suppression of free speech or beliefs, a tyranny of the majority, etc. So as some policies and practices of socialism emerge, they bring up new problems that require resolution through democratic means. And so true socialism is an ongoing process. First, some definitions before I jump into labor. Private property today are machines, offices, most buildings, most apartments, natural resources, computer programs, social and news media, railroads, energy production and distribution, etc. that are used, these are material things that are used by their owners to exploit others for profit. That's the definition of private property, at least my definition. Personal property is your car, house, clothes, home furnishings, phone, bank account, clothes, toothbrush, your beloved CD collection, etc., that you use every day to live life. That's your personal property. And public property, and this is my own definition again, is public lands and parks, libraries, roads, public schools, public transportation, airports, ports, most water and sewer systems, worker and consumer cooperatives, the money system, etc. These are things that are owned and managed by non-private entities for the public good, or at least in theory for the public good, right? Socialism aims to eliminate private property and turn it into public property. Socialism aims for everyone to have enough personal property to live a decent life. So the scaremongering that goes on about taking private property, this defines that you shouldn't be worried about your CD collection. I mentioned exploitation of others for profit. You might ask, what does this mean? It means simply that capitalist businesses can usually only make a profit, which is what's left over after expenses are paid, when workers are not paid entirely for what they produce. The capitalist pays less in wages than what the worker produces. This is a form of exploitation. Socialism seeks to end economic exploitation and other kinds, such as sexism and racism. To do this, property engaged in exploitation must be converted into property that serves the common good, or else eliminated. So how does this look from a worker's perspective? Since workers and the community will have control over the economically productive property, and I'm going to say some of you are way more advanced than what I'm going to be talking about, but I'm envisioning a society where there's a kind of a government of workers and unions and a parallel kind of a bicameral system where the community also has charge, and they come together to make decisions, economic decisions. What is produced, how it's produced, and how it's distributed are decisions that workers and the community will need to make jointly. These were decisions previously made by the owners of private property with information from the market and their relative strength to exploit to their advantage, which is why they do that? Well, because they can, right? The motive force in capitalism is the accumulation of profits by the owners of private property. Under socialism, the motive force is to serve ourselves and each other at the same time. People may say this is utopian, that people are not built this way. From what I've seen of the hundreds of low-wage workers I have worked with, that it is a very small percentage who are lazy or primarily self-centered, even under capitalism, that promotes the dog-eat-dog, cutthroat attitudes we see so prevalent among the billionaires. I see people working hard and often loath to think about themselves as more important than their customers. Sure, there is plenty of we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us kind of attitude, but this is more from resentment at being paid too little or working in a boring job or from incompetent management or all of the above. When given a chance, most people inherently want their work to have meaning in its usefulness to themselves and to the community, and to be paid enough to live a good life. Meaningful and socially productive work is an essential element in people's self-realization and fulfillment. Even so, some people cannot or even will not work. The socialism I foresee is one that guarantees to all, regardless of whether they work or not, the basics of life: food, housing, energy, water and sanitation, medical care, education, the internet, a political voice, etc. The practices of socialist self-management require some specific skills and knowledge currently not taught to most of us. For socialism to succeed, workers need to learn and practice democratic skills, organizing methods, business management, conflict resolution and bargaining, and the kind of understanding of other communities and their histories that the liberal arts curriculum promises. All of these and more will be part of all work training under socialism. Management of enterprises is a critical factor for their success. Generally, self-managed businesses would elect managers to their positions. Enterprises would normally teach management skills or make such training available. Management can rotate or remain elected as the worker owners see fit. Workers' attitudes to their work changes with this dynamic, as they now have a real and material interest in the, so I lost my place. A real and material interest in the field or business that they are employed. It is likely that workers will at times prioritize their work over the needs of the community. This is where community political structures come in as a check against this kind of excess. I'll give an example. A worker cooperative making paper and wood products may decide to use a chemical that increases their productivity and sales, but that can pollute the water table. A local government can set standards that either bans the chemical or bans its disposal into the water. Representatives from both the co-op and the local government would meet to discuss solutions to this dilemma. This kind of conflict will be attempted to be settled at the local level first. Failing that, larger bodies of workers in that sector and a regional community body could be called on to help and resolve the dispute. Perhaps another manufacturing process is available, or a way to not pollute the water, or a public education campaign to convince the community to alter their priorities, or an organizing campaign to have worker enterprises manufacture another product. All of these options are open under socialism that were either not available or very difficult to do under capitalism. Some kinds of work will be eliminated as it fails to meet community requirements. Coal mining is one example of this. Socialism would then require all such instances of this elimination of work categories to provide for a just transition to socially productive work. At the very least, the currency issuing government can provide lifetime pensions for workers in exchange for the loss of their work. The need for worker unions will not go away, but will be transformed into bodies of self-management and cooperation with local governments, as well as looking after the interests of the workers. This means that unions will need to be member-led, fully democratic, and concerned with the well-being of the community. In enterprises that are community or nationally owned even, unions will play a vital role in defending against abuse of workers by the enterprise and their owners, regardless of who they are. Worker salaries and benefits will generally not be subject to the capitalist market under socialism. All workers, at least in most work, all workers will make a living salary with robust benefits. If an enterprise does not make enough income to do this, then the government will supply the money to do so if the enterprise is decided by the community to be important for its well-being. To address issues of unemployment and inflation, a socialist economy will use a job guarantee program funded by the currency issuing government. Anyone who wants to work will be guaranteed a job that pays a living wage doing socially useful work that is not being adequately met by socialist enterprises. The currency issuing government will spend new money into the economy by creating these jobs, which in turn nearly automatically suppresses inflationary pressures while keeping unemployment low, as contrasted to the Federal Reserve setting interest rates, which pretty much has no effect on either one of those, at least beneficial effect. While it will still be up to individuals to take responsibility for their own self-realization, in the way I've only briefly described tonight, socialism can create the best conditions to allow people the opportunity to become the best people they can be. And we all need to develop our own thoughts on what socialism can look like so we can participate in the ongoing conversation of what life will be like after capitalism.
Well, thank you, Mark. And in my vision of a post-capitalist future, we would never lose our place. So let me introduce next Dave Quattrochi, or DQ, lives in Missoula, currently working as a community organizer focused on social drivers of health for a federally qualified health center. He is an organizer member of the Missoula Tenants Union and is a dues-paying member of Democratic Socialists of America. He helped launch Street Watch LA and Services Not Sweeps Coalition, both in Los Angeles, and also the Unhoused Neighbors Union here in Missoula. All efforts are housing justice groups fighting for universal housing access and the end to criminalized poverty. So to you, David.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so yeah, okay. So if I say anything that maybe you agree with, if you want to, or if you don't like it, boo. feel free if you don't want to, but we can try it out. Like, it was great that we had food provided here today, right? City Hall doesn't provide that at their meetings. You're great. You did great. If you don't want to do this, you don't have to. So yes, I'll be talking. Do we have the slides, Brian?
Let me, while we're putting pause on DQ, we'll come back to him. Justice York is a soil conservationist working with farmers, ranchers, and forest landowners throughout Missoula and Mineral counties to integrate conservation practices into their operations, improve soil health, increase local food security, and help prevent productive lands from being sold off into development. She received her bachelor's in natural resource conservation, policy, and economics from the University of Idaho, and a master's in sustainable development with an emphasis in water policy and traditional ecological knowledge from the University of Arizona. And now, Justice York.
Thank you, Robbie. So I'm going to be maybe less fun than DQ was. I'm going to give everybody here some homework to take home with them tonight. One of the things that we really need to strengthen is our imagination muscles. When we try to imagine what a world post-capitalism is going to look like, that's really hard for a lot of us to do because for all of us, for the most part, it's all we've ever known. So after listening to all of these inspiring talks, hopefully you're feeling inspired after these talks, I encourage you to go home and have these conversations with your friends, your family, and your community members to really get these conversations going. Like, we have to imagine what this post-capitalist world is going to look like, and that is on us to be able to bring that into existence. So my portion of the talk is going to be on our relationship to the environment in a post-capitalist world. Next slide. So I'm sure I don't need to remind all of you the numerous ecological crises that we are currently facing under capitalism, not the least of which being climate change, biodiversity and habitat loss, microplastics that we all have in our blood now, industrial agriculture. But this is supposed to be a hopeful talk. So I'm not going to focus on all the problems because I'm sure we're all intimately aware of the problems that exist under the capitalist economic system, and we're going to focus on solutions. So some of the solutions that we can implement in a post-capitalist system to be better stewards of the environment and better neighbors and community members to each other are to implement an eco-socialist economy. Just as Mark was describing, eco-socialism is basically just socialism, but we are also putting planetary needs and planetary well-being right up there with human well-being and human needs. Also, a degrowth economy, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth. Land back and traditional ecological knowledge, high-speed rail, walkable cities, renewable energy, biodegradable plastics, regenerative agriculture. This is by no means an exhaustive list. I hope we have some time to have some discussion after these talks, and I would love to hear your guys' ideas for ways we could be better stewards of the environment and create a more equitable and sustainable world that maybe aren't included up here yet. Next slide. So first and foremost, we must learn to see ourselves as part of rather than separate from nature. This is a phenomenon that is very common in modern society, especially for people that grew up maybe in cities or suburban environments where you didn't have any sort of direct connection to the land. Restructuring the way we live our lives and the way we see ourselves as being integral to part of nature, because that is who we are. The earth is our oldest ancestor, and the natural resources and the other species exist in communion with us. And leading with that perspective is going to be very important in the way we restructure society outside of capitalism. So in order to do this, it's going to require a radical change in our production and consumption habits for the global population, but especially for those of us that live in the global north, countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and most of Western Europe, because we by far and away consume the most resources. That is the biggest single solution when it comes to being better stewards of the environment, is to reduce our consumption and our demands on the environment. Next slide. So land back and traditional ecological knowledge. So the land back movement is a movement of returning land to indigenous communities. That's either going to be through direct title transfers, conservation easements, or sales. And this is not an eviction notice for people that are not indigenous or native. This is really just a legal recognition that tribes, rather than corporations or state and federal agencies, are the primary voices in land and development decisions. And when we look at the ways that indigenous communities exist in relationship to nature, we see that that body of wisdom that has been passed down over time through generations is more equitable and more sustainable. And a lot of the ways that they exist in relationship to the environment, for example, one of the ways that we can probably see here in the Western United States, right, is we have suppressed the natural fire regime over centuries. And indigenous communities had prescribed burns almost every single year to reduce hazardous fuel loads, to improve soil health, to improve biodiversity, where we came in and really suppressed that natural fire regime. We saw fire as big, bad, scary. And so that has resulted in all of the forests across the Western United States being overstocked. So we see increasingly long wildfire seasons. We see hotter fires, more abundant fires, fires burning greater acreages. And so incorporating those, that traditional ecological knowledge into these systems of environmental management is very important. And it's also, the land back and tech movement is an invitation for all of us to get back to our roots, to increase our own ecological knowledge, and to increase our own connection to the land. We live in ecologically diverse, beautiful places, but how many of us can actually go out and walk around our neighborhoods, or go out into rattlesnake area or into our national forest and actually identify edible and medicinal plants? You know, this is knowledge that has been lost over many generations, and we need to find our way back to increasing that knowledge within current generations, so that we're creating strong, locally resilient, more sustainable, self-sufficient communities. Next slide. So what is degrowth? This is a big movement happening right now, and degrowth is really, it is the intentional reduction of material and energy production in order to bring human activity back within ecological limits. Under the capitalist economic system, we are fastly approaching many planetary boundaries. Because of that exponential growth in a finite system, we know that we cannot keep growing capital and profit infinitely in a finite system. And so the degrowth movement is one that is really focused on intentionally reducing our production and consumption of non-necessary resources. And so we would see massive reductions in certain sectors of the economy, such as fossil fuels, fast fashion, mass-produced meat and dairy, cars, aviation, and advertising. So what we would really be focusing on first and foremost is meeting needs before wants, and elimination of planned obsolescence. I'm sure we all have heard of planned obsolescence, and we absolutely despise it. We're going to be making products that are meant to last, just like we used to do. Right? And so we are reducing, we're reusing, we're recycling. You know, if we don't always have to have the next iPhone, the next brand new car, you know, we're going to make things that last and are able to be refurbished and reused, and increasing those skills, again, to create these more locally self-sufficient economies. We would also see massive wealth redistribution to fund universal basic services such as healthcare, education, infrastructure, and agriculture. And these are truly universal services. This is not just something that we would see here in the United States. The global north and a lot of these major corporations and companies and billionaires are going to be funding this through that massive wealth redistribution, largely from the global north to the global south. And we would also see massive investments in needs like high-speed rail and public transit, biking infrastructure, and walkable cities and neighborhoods. Next slide. So one of the main proponents of the degrowth movement right now, his name is Jason Hickel. This is one of his books. And a lot of the research in this book is based on this paper that shows that humanity could meet everyone's basic needs And basic needs include those universal basic needs of healthcare, education, nutrition, social well-being, and ensure a good life for all, which would be basic needs and then some, using only 15 to 30 gigajoules of energy, which I cannot explain to you really what that looks like. But what's important is that is about 40 to 70% less than the current demands for energy that we're currently seeing worldwide. So right now, we're using an average of 53 gigajoules of energy per person per year. And this study was a study of more than 106 countries looking at how much energy was required to meet humans' basic needs in many different cultural environments. At a global scale, this would mean reducing the total energy demand in half. So we already have the technology, we already have the resources, we already have the skills and the knowledge and the know-how to meet all of humanity's basic needs. The study was based on 8.5 billion people as is, using half the amount of energy that we are currently using just by reducing our consumption and distributing it more equitably. Next slide. High-speed rail. Let's do the snap if we want to see high-speed rail. And why don't we have it? Because we have an airline lobby and an airline industry that has record-breaking profits every single year, and it's getting worse and worse for all of us. But high-speed rail isn't as profitable as the airline industry, and high-speed rail would largely replace a lot of flights. But when it comes to the environment and being more sustainable, high-speed rail uses 4 to 10 times less energy per passenger mile than cars, and up to 9 times less energy than airplanes. And if powered by renewable energy sources such as solar, high-speed rail emissions can fall below 10 grams of carbon dioxide per mile, which is essentially negligible when compared to aviation. And then the energy and carbon payback of constructing all the infrastructure required to build the high-speed rail, so all of the rail itself and the tunnels, typically occurs within just 5 to 10 years for operations of busy lines. Next slide, thank you. This graph shows the energy and CO2 emissions per passenger mile for different modes of transportation. You can see the largest CO2 emitter is short-haul flights, and that's largely what high-speed rail would be reducing or replacing. So when you think of flights from places like Missoula to Seattle, that's an hour-long flight. We can easily replace that if we invest in high-speed rail and significantly reduce the energy required and the emissions coming from those modes of travel. Next slide. Ocean water desalination. This is one maybe a lot of folks haven't heard of. I studied this a bit in grad school. I'll caveat that by no means any of these are a perfect solution. There are still environmental effects from ocean water desalination, especially when we're talking about bringing the water in from the ocean and what we're doing with the byproduct, what we're doing from the brine. But in an environment where we are facing, I'm not going to say catastrophic, when we're facing serious effects of climate change and water scarcity and conflict over that water scarcity and increasing demands for water, especially with the advent of AI, we're going to need to find a way to secure more fresh water to meet human needs, human and environmental needs. And as the oceans constitute 97% of the world's water, this is an abundant resource, especially because of climate change. We're seeing that our glaciers melting and the Arctic and Antarctic melting and sea levels rising, which are putting coastal communities and islands at risk. So in some ways, it's kind of a win-win solution, but it's not a perfect one. Saudi Arabia has really spent a lot of money on developing their desalination infrastructure, and the last time I looked into this, they were securing over 60% of their drinking water from ocean water desalination, and a lot of their plants are starting to be powered by solar power, which uses a lot less energy and reduces the dependence on fossil fuels while increasing our accessibility to this precious resource. Next slide. Walkable cities. Let's get a little snap for that. I think that's something that the Missoula City Council is working on with their zoning code reform to try and create higher density mixed-use development. So we'd love to see that. When we have walkable cities, it lowers our dependence on cars. We see that a lot in the United States. We are a very car-centric, car-dependent country. And so when we build cities and neighborhoods in a way where we have like that first level are clinics and restaurants and cafes, community-owned banks, and we've got houses and apartments above them, people are able to drive less, walk more, bike more, which is reducing greenhouse gas emissions. It's improving local air quality. It's reducing urban sprawl. So we're taking less habitat away from other species and messing less with their migration corridors. And that higher density mixed use development also preserves a lot of green space as well. Next slide. Last slide, I'm almost done, thank goodness, I'm so nervous. Okay, so regenerative agriculture, this is more my area of expertise, but the way that we produce agriculture right now is an industrial form of agriculture where we have thousands of acres of just one single crop. You know, monocropping is kind of the way we tend to produce a lot of food in this country, and that makes us really reliant on synthetic fertilizers and synthetic pesticides and tillage practices, which breaks up our soil structure. In a regenerative system, we're building soil organic matter, which creates a healthier soil microbiome, which is able to draw down more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It increases biodiversity of crops and livestock, which increases the ecosystem resiliency. Improving that soil structure reduces the amount of soil that's eroding due to wind and water erosion, especially because of those intensive tillage practices. And it significantly reduces our dependence on synthetic fertilizers and pesticides. One thing that's really controversial to talk about is eating more of a plant-based diet. I by no means am trying to talk anybody into being a vegetarian or vegan, but our diet really does have a significant effect on the environment, and meat consumption is a two-step process where you have all of the land required to grow the grain and the feed for the livestock, and as well as all of the land for the livestock itself. And it's also very water intensive, and so just eating a little less meat, you know, can go a long ways. Because while we're trying to overthrow this system and dismantle the capitalist economic system, we also do have a personal responsibility in the way we show up in our lives, and we can try and remove ourselves from that capitalist economic system that's exploitative, it's oppressive, it's extractive. We have choices in the day-to-day. And so I encourage people to really reassess their relationship to one another and their relationship to the environment, and maybe try eating a little more locally and in season if we can afford it. And that's what I've got for you guys. Thank you.
Okay.
Oh, it's really hot.
Tony, did you find his PowerPoint? Okay, great. So let me again introduce Dave Quattrochi, who needs no further introduction. DQ.
Thank you. Hey. You almost missed this.
Thank you to our Brian Myers, our tech man.
Yeah, thank you, Brian. I think I had assigned permission but didn't send the email probably. My bad. In the post-capitalist world, I won't do that. Okay, so hi, I'm David Quattrochi. I'm by no means a healthcare expert, insofar as maybe all of us are. So I will just talk about what healthcare might look like once we overthrow the system, as our two previous speakers had talked about. So I'm going to call this post-capitalist healthcare. This is a very unwieldy title. Or reorienting our ability to care for all around the social drivers of health, community well-being, and ourselves. Yeah, remember that? You don't have to do it. I don't know how many gigajoules of energy it takes to do that. Brian, I'll just kind of point when the slide. Oh, you did it. Okay, when we gather like this in rooms like this one, or in mutual aid kitchens, or sidewalks, union halls, Zoom calls, we aren't just meeting. And kind of like Justice went over, we're dreaming. Organizing spaces are what are sometimes called dream factories. They're where we refuse the world we've been handed, this one, and begin sketching the one that must come next. These spaces, our spaces, are more than places of resistance. They're places of invention, little laboratories of what could be possible. Because when so much of life is organized around profit, when care, safety, and rest have been turned into luxuries, it becomes revolutionary to imagine otherwise. So tonight, let's begin with a simple radical question. What would healthcare look like if it were not bound to capital, not something earned, not something rationed, but shared as a condition of being alive? That question leads us into a couple authors I'm going to talk about, just because people are so much smarter than me out in the world. I will defer to a couple texts, one being Beatrice Adler Bolton's and Artie Virkant's Health Communism. That's what the book is called. And I'm going to butcher this. Bear with me. Sozialistisches Patientenkollektiv, the Socialist Patients Collective. And their text was called Turn Illness into a Weapon. Two works that do more than critique what exists. They demand that we start building what's next. So this section we call Health Communism. There's a QR if you want to find where you can get this book. I tried to find a free online version. I don't know where it exists, if it does. So the two authors, Adler, Bolton, and Virkant, begin with a sharp observation. Under capitalism, health isn't a right. It's a sorting mechanism. The system divides us into deserving and the undeserving. Those who can work, who can produce, who can be profitable, they're granted access to care. Those who can't, the chronically ill, the disabled, the poor, the elderly, the uninsured, become what these authors call the surplus class. And the healthcare industry is not designed to heal the divide between the two classes. It's designed to manage it. Every insurance claim denied, every eligibility test, every copay barrier, all of it enforces the same logic, that care must be justified through productivity, that your right to live well depends on your usefulness to the market. Shame. Thank you, good night. But capitalism doesn't keep us alive. It reproduces death. Slowly, bureaucratically, profitably. It allows an entire industry to scapegoat the sick, to name its illness itself as precarious, when it is the industry that is precarious, parasitic, and it's built on our suffering. The body, boo. The body is the site where capitalism must fight, gaslight, and commodify. Our labor, our exhaustion, our pain, our recovery, all become data points for extraction. To be healthy under capitalism is to be functional to the system, not whole within ourselves. We see this logic everywhere. In Missoula, where city leaders claim people become whole once they purchase homes, as if property repairs the soul. It's the same logic that says a body becomes valuable only when it can work. Wholeness in this view is not about care, it's about market integration. A post-capitalist vision of healthcare rejects all of this. It begins with the understanding that there will be no place for insurance companies in our world after capitalism. No billing codes, no networks, no denials. And we must also understand, talking to my brother Luigi, right? No single act of retaliation, no outburst or headline can fix a system built on organized abandonment. This is not a crisis solved by punishment. It is a crisis solved by reconstruction. We must reorient the system practically around the social drivers of self, around housing, around food, community, and connection. That's the goal. And build it upon the philosophy that care itself is the ultimate goal. Health communism calls us to imagine a system where healthcare is not conditional, not earned through labor or citizenship, A network of care rooted in abundance, not austerity. Clinics, housing, food, rest, organized as commons, not commodities. Because health is not an individual achievement, it's a collective condition. So I'm going to talk about these next authors that I butchered their name, our comrades in West Germany back in the late 70s. This was a literal patient collective that organized around health, and the shop site or the struggle site were their own bodies. And they were called SPK for short. The Socialist Patient Collective. The phrase turn illness into a weapon didn't start as a metaphor. It comes from the Socialist Patient Collective, the SPK, a radical collective of patients and psychiatrists in 1970s West Germany. They declared that illness is not an individual problem, but a social condition. They believed that if illness was produced by capitalism, then patients could unite, could collectivize their suffering, and use it as revolutionary knowledge and power. I point to our local Missoula Tenants Union. They say, as part of our slogan, those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Same logic, same revolutionary logic. Like Mark, I've lost my place. They meant it literally, though, to turn illness into a weapon against a system that treats bodies as disposable. Decades later, a scholar named Johanna Hedva, who's still with us, reclaimed that same phrase but transformed its meaning. For Hedva, turning illness into a weapon isn't about armed revolt. It's about a revolt of care. It's about using the visibility of pain, the slowness of the sick body, and as a form of refusal. Refusing productivity, refusing legibility, refusing the capitalist idea that only the strong are worthy of care. Hedva reframes illness as a political condition, not a private tragedy. And when we map that insight onto homelessness, for instance, perhaps the most visible, most punished health condition, the connection becomes devastatingly clear. Homelessness, too, is not a personal failure. It is a political condition and an industry for these parasites. One that, like illness, capitalism depends on and reproduces. It spreads through austerity, eviction, policing, and neglect, while parasitic industries form around it. Shelter systems that warehouse instead of house, policing that criminalizes survival, outreach programs that surveil instead of liberate. Whole markets now depend on managing suffering rather than ending it. Boo. And yet, within these conditions, people are organizing. Chronically ill and disabled folks building care webs, unhoused neighbors running encampment kitchens and medic tents, trans people, poor people, our native siblings navigating the bureaucratic hell of the Indian health system, all creating care in the cracks of empire. These are not stopgaps, they're blueprints. They're the living sketches of a post-capitalist healthcare world already under construction, a world that centers those most exploited by capitalism's health order. Because the point of revolt and unity is not perfection, it is our illness under capitalism. Just as a labor movement that Mark talked about, organized around unsafe work, housing justice, movements organized around unsafe homes, we organize around the shared condition of being sick by the same system. To move toward that world, we must also reorient our understanding of labor. Similar to what Mark was talking about, work should become an as-needed activity, like cooking or cleaning or gardening, something we do when necessary, not an addiction enforced by corporate pressure or economic coercion. Snap, snap, snap. Labor, like everything else, must serve life, not the other way around. So envisioning together. Usually this is where in the presentation, we'd stop after the critique, after naming what's broken, but let's break a little from the pattern. Let's move from analysis to imagination, like Justice urged us to do. Let's return to where we began. The organizing space as a dream factory. If health communism gives us the critique and turn illness into a weapon, gives us the refusal, then our task is the building. Every organizing meeting, every encampment, every free fridge, every classroom, each is a site of world building. Each is a rehearsal for the post-capitalist world we insist must exist. So I'll leave you with questions, not for theory, but for invention, right? Because you've all got the fire lit under your ass now, right? So I'll leave you with that. What would it mean to organize healthcare around abundance, not scarcity? How might we build care networks that don't wait for permission? What forms of care can we create now, right now, that make the capitalist healthcare system obsolete before it collapses? Close your eyes for a second if you want. Picture the world we're going to build. The clinic that doesn't bill you. The housing that doesn't evict you. The care that doesn't ask what you can contribute before it helps you. That's not utopian, that's possible. And in small ways, it's already here. It's here every time we show up for one another, every time we refuse to let the market decide who gets to live, every time we build care as if the world were already otherwise. So let's not leave tonight as students of critique. Let's leave as builders, because you all are, as dreamers, and as architects of the care that we deserve. Thank you.
And actually, we're going to have a slightly unexpected change in order here. I want to introduce Celia Winkler next. Hope that's not too confusing for anybody. I might add just to what you were saying, DQ, we would also have a world in which the environment is not making us ill and where our work, what we do for a living, isn't killing us. So Celia Winkler, to my left, is working as a professor of sociology at the University of Montana, where her is retired from working as a professor at the University of Montana, where her primary areas of interest are and were theory, political sociology, poverty, welfare states, and gender. Her dissertation examined the development of the Swedish welfare state with a focus on single motherhood. Prior to earning her PhD in sociology from the University of Oregon, she worked as a legal services attorney during the Reagan administration, having graduated from what is now known as UC Law San Francisco, formerly known as Hastings College of Law, named after its founder, who amassed his wealth through the genocide of the Yuki people of California in the mid-1800s. And now, Celia Winkler.
Thank you. Thanks for letting me go next, because I'm one of those people who has that sort of that illness issue, so yes, the healthcare system kind of failed me for a while. So anyway, what I'm going to be talking about, and I'm actually going to take us back into some dark places, maybe like capitalism. And what I want to focus on is the situation of what kinship did to the situation, to the way that we relate to one another. So, next slide, please. Whoops, what happened there? Holy moly. Okay, sorry about that. It didn't transfer very well. My introduction should be, on one side, it should say from dependency and other to interdependence and solidarity. And the analysis from dependency and other is your Common and Garden socialist feminist analysis that probably a lot of you are so familiar with, that this is going to be a review of like 30 years ago, okay? But what I want to move into is another way of looking at things, and particularly the notion of interdependence and solidarity that were developed by Joan Toronto, Nancy Fraser, and Jody Dean. So when I'm talking about capitalism, I'm going to talk about necessary labor and surplus labor. Does that sound familiar to everybody? Marx, bring back Marx. Reproductive labor, that should bring back some socialist feminist perspective. The notion of dependency, the nucleated family and white nationalism, and then otherness and exclusion. That's sort of the capitalist model. The post-capitalist model that I see is care work and voice, interdependency, reflective solidarity, and inclusion. So next slide. Next slide. Holy moly. It's really butchered. Holy moly. Okay. That's not what mine looks like. No. Okay. So,
Which one to plug in
well, shall we just plug in?
Here,
Okay.
this is- I can plug in.
It has the C. USB-C. It's C. You don't have I have a connector. I have a C connector.
You do?
I'm wondering if it's because it's not pulled up in
Oh, okay. Never mind. Okay.
this PowerPoint app.
Okay. Well, I'll just run through this really quickly. So, just as a quick review, when we think about labor, oftentimes we think about necessary labor and surplus value, right? Necessary labor is the labor that's necessary to support the workers and their families, and the surplus value is the profit that goes to the capitalist. So capitalism then depends on minimizing the amount of wage dedicated to the cost of keeping the worker alive. That would be shelter, clothing, nutrition, health care, and so forth. But it also includes reproductive labor. Hey, yay, next one. Next slide. Next slide. There we go, okay. Okay, so capitalism depends upon minimizing the amount of the wage that's dedicated to the cost of keeping the worker alive. And it's shelter and clothing and so forth, but it's also what we socialist feminists call reproductive labor. And that is the cleaning, the immediate food preparation, socialization, the physical and emotional care. It is the reproduction of not only the next generation, but also this generation of workers. So next slide. So to keep the cost of necessary labor low, reproductive labor then must be kept low paid or unpaid. And so it can be commodified as a source of profit, of course. But still the costs are expected to be assumed by the worker. And traditionally, however, this reproductive labor is done in the home. The result is that most people assigned the role of performing reproductive labor have little control over material assets. They just don't have time. Okay, so if you're doing reproductive labor, you don't have a lot of time to do the kind of labor that'll bring in a wage. So you tend to be poor. So next slide. So in capitalism and previous European economic systems, power and decision-making was accorded to those with control over material assets. Those include, but are not limited to, means of production and distribution, of course. Those without control over material assets then are dependent, and this is a key term. It's what you were talking about as, what was the term that you used? Surplus. It's, yeah, you're the dependent class. You are dependent upon those with control over the material assets. Those who are dependent are traditionally denied voice or the right to make decisions, both publicly and intimately. So, next slide. The unpaid reproductive labor in the home, traditionally in the family, the wage earner is gendered male, the housewife is gendered female, and because of the responsibility for childcare and unpaid reproductive labor, result is the motherhood penalty, which is lower pay due to a host of factors associated with labor market requirements. So whether it's the motherhood penalty or being out of the labor force entirely, the person, usually gendered female, who is assigned the responsibility for reproductive labor, both structurally and ideologically, has less control over material assets, and therefore less power in decision-making, and therefore less voice. In a traditional marital relationship, this can be thought of as legitimate dependency. So you are legitimately dependent upon your husband, right, in the traditional family. But this is still dependency nonetheless, and it can create a power relationship resulting in various forms of subjugation and violence. There was a great article that was written by a friend of mine called "No Exit, No Voice." If you don't have the ability to leave a relationship, you have less power within that relationship. Next slide. So what we can see is this model here is taken from the Scandinavian welfare state studies called the welfare triangle. And in the welfare triangle, the idea is that the person can rely upon support for their well-being from the market, from the family, and the state. But in the United States, we rely a lot on NGOs, charities. So I call it the welfare triangle. And in the capitalist model, it's the individual sitting in the middle of that box. The thing is that if any of those sources are cut off, you become more dependent upon those other sources for your well-being. There are legitimate sources in our society. There's legitimate sources and illegitimate sources. The legitimate sources for your well-being are market and family, like having a job and being supported by your family. The illegitimate sources are charity and public assistance, SNAP benefits, Medicaid, and so forth. So next slide. What this ends up doing, this notion of illegitimate dependency then creates the other. So if you're not in a legitimate marital relationship, this is illegitimate dependency relying on charity or public assistance. And if you're in illegitimate dependency, you're defined as the other. But the hegemony of the nucleated family, trad man, trad wife, creates an insider and outsider ontology. That is how we define reality. So we define reality as inside and outside. Do you belong? Do you not belong? I take care of my kids. I don't care about your kids. Okay? The ontology of the insider-outsider extends from intimate relations to racialized relationships and ethnic constructions, and you can think of white Christian nationalism as the terminus, if you will, of this insider-outsider construction. But kinship is not all bad. Next slide. Kinship has been a source of protection and resistance throughout the millennia. Capitalism has evolved since the dominance of the family wage economy to expect female labor force participation. That means that it is difficult and even impossible for many to survive without the economic and social support of kin. In the 1960s and 70s in Sweden, and this was my dissertation study, that Sweden prioritized women's economic independence as a way to remove power relations from the family. The power relations that are endemic to unequal control over material assets, structurally and ideologically transferring responsibility for some of the reproductive labor to the partner who is gendered male. And they did that through what's called the Papa Month. It was a use it or lose it of paid parental leave. If you didn't, there was at least, now there's 2 months. There's like a couple months that are set aside for the other parent. And that was a way to actually bring men into the work of reproductive labor. So the issue then is how to retain the benefits of kinship without stigmatizing the other through the insider-outsider ontology. So that's where we get into post-capitalism for me. So next slide. So I'm going to talk about care work and voice, interdependency, reflective solidarity, and finally inclusion. Next slide. Capitalism and post-capitalism. What would be, for me, it's sort of like in order to attain post-capitalism, we have to stop the theft of surplus value by the capitalists. And we need democratically controlled surplus value used to compensate care work and those who require it. By the way, I'm going to change terminology now, going from reproductive labor, which was the old socialist feminist language, to care work, which is the new socialist feminist language. So, next slide. So reproductive labor is basically care work. Care work, according to Joan Toronto, is the work that is done to maintain, continue, and repair. Now that's not just, when we think of reproductive labor, it's what happens inside the home, but what we're talking about is also with your friends. You repair your relationships with your friends. You maintain and continue those relationships. You fix your communities. That involves the regenerative agriculture and those types of things. Though that kind of activity is also considered care work by Joan Toronto. It's everything that's done to continue, repair, and maintain our communities, our nation, and the globe. Care work is considered of the same importance in my post-capitalist imagination as any other kind of work because it is no longer a drag on profit. It can become a matter of public democratic concern. So next slide. So rather than the capitalist model of the dependent caregiver, in the post-capitalist world, we would recognize that we are all interdependent. We are all involved in the work of maintaining, continuing, and repairing. We all, in our various ways, need to produce and use the results of production. We all, in our various ways, need to give care and to receive care. And we all, in our various ways, need to be heard and to listen. And that's that interrelationship of care, material resources, and voice that actually the Swedish socialist feminists discovered, which was really cool. Those are not contained in rigid roles. It's not a trad man, trad wife, it's not a janitor, it's not an executive, but they interact in fluid and constantly changing ways. Next slide. So this introduces this concept of reflective solidarity, which is discussed by Jody Dean. If you've ever read her stuff, she's amazing. But if there's no hierarchy, who decides? You can say, oh, democratically, well, decide democratically. And Mark raised the issue really well of how do we democratically decide? There's a whole lot of steps involved in that. It's deceptively simple to say, oh, we'll just decide democratically. Some boundaries are needed. Some people are involved in the decision making, others are not. But that those boundaries are flexible and they are not exclusive. They can define we-ness without defining they-ness. We can be a we without saying they, the other, right? We-ness is based on reflective solidarity. It's a mutual expectation of responsible orientation to a relationship based on dialectics. You all know what this is that notion of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. So it's in that it is in the context of discussion and disagreement that we actually become a community. The disagreement is the basis for a shared understanding and commitments, and we is a verb. We is a verb. We actively participate in being a we. The discursive achievement of a whole lot of individual I's. Okay, so next slide. So changing the terrain and the ontology. So I want to change the terrain and ontology from family, race, closed circles to that are economically and socially prescribed rigid roles. And instead we become community where people can explore and articulate differences necessary for, that should be concrete, identities, longing for recognition. Family as enclosed, we-ness implying they-ness, becomes using the voice of the third. So here you have your family, and you pay attention to someone outside your family. That third constructs solidarity as an inclusionary ideal. We become attuned to the vulnerability of the mutable and variable identities. We are aware of what others are doing because they are not they are part of our community. They belong to the multiple we in a variety of mutable identities, variety of groups play a role in the development of different identities. So one of the things that's really important here is we understand that we're all different within our groups. Our groups don't define who we are. We're not a member of one group. We're not a member of one family. We're not a member of one town. We're not a member of one party. We're not a member of one nation. We are all of those things. We are workers, we are lovers, we are hikers, we are gardeners, we are all of those things that make up our identities. And all those groups to which we belong include not only the present, but also the voices of the past and the future. So then we become aware of those as well. The last slide here, the next slide, is inclusion. So conventional and what I'm calling cheap solidarity is based on total agreement, sameness, uniformity. It restricts our available identities. It requires us, we'll all agree, we won't disagree. We need to disagree. That's the essence of creating the we. I was reminded of Ursula Le Guin's short story, The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. Is everyone familiar with that? Anyone not? Yeah. Okay, very short, very quickly, the short story is you had this perfect community. Turns out it was only perfect because of the subjugation and torture of a child in the basement of the county courthouse. And at one point, children, when they become like 12 or 13 years old, they're brought in to see the child, to know that their perfect community exists because of the subjugation of that child. Do you stay in that community, that perfect, peaceful community, or do you leave? So, reflective solidarity understands the existence of that child whom we have subjugated, we have tortured. And we bring her into our homes and into our lives. Reflective solidarity understands community as concern for the welfare of an other, as crucial to their conception of themselves as a group. So you need to struggle not against enemies, but against forces, actions, attitudes, limitations. So we struggle against capitalism. We don't necessarily, I mean, yeah, some capitalists are real super jerks. But that's not the main problem. The main problem is capitalism, right? Okay, so, but also dissent then. So I also want to urge us not to be angry amongst, this is one of the downfalls of the left, may I say, is we have a tendency to eat our own, right? Right. Okay. Recognize that dissent within us, within our groups, within our work, within our community, is the basis for our interconnection and shared mutual recognition of each other. So the question I ask, is that possible still within the context of capitalism? I'm done.
Thank you so much, Celia. In a post-capitalist future, all PowerPoints will always work. So let me, excuse me. Let me introduce next Josh Decker. He's a 30-year Missoula resident. Josh Decker has been involved in the housing struggle in many ways throughout his time here. He was also DSA co-chair a few years back. As a carpenter, home remodeler, tenants union member, maintenance worker, and advocate to the unhoused, he has been building community in the wake of the destructive forces of capitalism. Josh will be talking about housing. Josh.
Hey, folks. What a lot of great things we've talked about tonight. One of the things that sticks out for me is imagination muscles. I'm going to use my imagination muscles to pretend I am a good public speaker. So we start with land back. Justice mentioned land back and talked about it, gave a great detailed definition of it. It's a controversial idea. Why is it controversial? Because we're afraid that the implementation of an idea like land back would come in the form of fairness and not in the form of equity. If it arrived in the form of fairness, that would mean the same injustices that we've visited upon Native people would be visited upon us. That's not what land back is talking about, but it is a housing idea. And we'll go to the next slide. So, what's housing? As we click through on this slide, surely housing is shelter. But is it just shelter? I think everybody would agree that it's not only shelter. How does shelter become housing? As we add these other things into the equation, dignity, health, privacy, safety, community, family, that's when shelter starts to make the transition into housing. It's a basic need, not a product, right? And right now, it's treated as a product. If we look at it as part of our gross domestic product, roughly, $27 trillion American gross domestic product, it's about 18% of that, or four and a little bit trillion dollars. That's a lot of effort and energy that goes into housing. We look at that as a juxtaposition to how much waste other people have already talked about here tonight. We've talked about waste in food, in healthcare. We've talked about waste when it comes to environmental concerns. There's a lot of extra energy in our world. 40% of the food we produce gets thrown away. We have a military that's almost consuming $1 trillion worth of our effort, worth of our collective effort as Americans. That's a quarter of the housing situation, right? Just gets written as a blank check to our military. Does housing contain things like art, things like joy? When does it actually become a home to a person? These are all the questions that, I'm not an expert on housing, certainly. We're all experts on our own housing. We're all experts on what it means to us, what it needs to be, and what it is now, where the differences between those two lie. We go to the next slide. So, is this housing? Is this one over here, that one, is that housing or shelter? Is that housing? That's certainly shelter. This person looks like they have some form of shelter. Is it housing? When we see opulence and greed in our society, other folks have talked about other solutions to greed. But when we see that stuff, we have to look at opulence and gluttony in housing as a reflection of a loss of dignity for someone else's housing. It is a give and take situation. We can click through. So, we have an idea of maybe modest housing versus an idea of, what a single family house could be if your family contained 300 or 400 people, We can't end capitalism and set the current system that we have in stone. We can't cast it in amber. There has to be a redistribution. So the fear is that redistribution would come in the form of fairness, right? as opposed to equity. So how does capitalism affect housing? It affects how we get housing. You got to talk to the bank. It limits what's available. It dictates where adequate housing is located. One of the things it most indicates is who is eligible for housing. David talked a lot about this. If your status as a disabled person makes it so you're not eligible for any of the benefits of capitalism, let alone housing. Capitalism is often framed in terms of what it provides. Capitalism built all these houses. Or framed in terms of what it does, what has it given us. But we need to flip that over and understand, what does capitalism prevent? Is it actually giving us these things that we need in our lives, or is it preventing anything that is unprofitable? Anything that doesn't have an extra dollar attached to it to be pushed towards the top is a bad idea, out of hand, just right off the bat, right? It requires excess, profit first. So profit first, purpose second. Any idea under capitalism first requires profit, then meets the purpose. So I was reading an article by Tom Mallison the other day, and the headline of the article was, "No, the rich don't deserve their wealth." Economic production in a modern society is never a solo effort. All production is at root a fundamentally social and collaborative process. The standard meritocratic view of deservingness is a lie and a deception. Modern production is a deeply interdependent process involving background labor and background institutions of much of the community, as well as millions of our deceased ancestors. The wealth of the rich is not deserved. It's our social inheritance being misused, and we have the right to take it back. We'll go on from there. So, in the absence of a legitimate and functional social safety net, housing is the solution, right? You have to have an asset that you can hold on to until you need it, when then you can trade it in for tokens to live the rest of your life as you age, right? What is our actual social safety net in America? You know, it's hopefully you own enough things so that as you slow down at the end of your life, you're not cashiering at Walmart. You know, you are taken care of, right? We have to trade housing for our care. We have to shift housing from a need to a thing we exploit someone else for in order to be credited enough so that we can then take a break, sit down, be 80, you know. All right. We'll go to the next one. When the lens of profit is occluded, other frames emerge. There will be less of a lot of things without capitalism, but it's not the things that the capitalist would have you believe. As generational trauma caused by capitalism fades away, so will the problematic behaviors of all of capitalism's victims. And this goes to what Celia was saying. Even the uber capitalist is a victim of their own system. Everybody is a victim of capitalism, right? It's hard to quantify. The pain feels more real to someone that's closer to a working class life than it does to a Mark Zuckerberg. But everyone is a victim of capital. There will be less of a lot of things, hopefully racism, colonialism, discrimination based on identity. All of those things will be less as other frames emerge. All right. Next one. So, one of the worst of capitalism's punishments, as David mentioned, is the prospect of becoming unhoused. We dangle this threat over people that can't be fully productive all the time. We have, why is it in Missoula that we have laws like the incredibly disastrous 12.60 law that outlaws camping in public parks? It only outlaws camping if you're homeless. If you're a housed person, you can go have a nap in the park between 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. It's exclusively for unhoused people that these regulations are written. It exists, and it's based on a frame of false scarcity. Justice did a really good job of explaining that there is enough, in fact. It's capitalism's biggest myth that we're to believe that it's not enough, that there's not going to be enough for anyone. So, next slide. So, how are we currently trying to move towards justice, fairness, security, and sustainability? There's a lot of good things going on in our world right now. We have co-ownership models of housing, shared burden models, communes, things like that, land trusts. We have tenants unions and renters organizations, and these are really important. Their efforts at establishing balance and equity as opposed to fairness, like we said. So, go to the next slide. The tenant unions that we see today all around the country will grow into the decision-making structures for future housing models. This is what Mark was talking about in terms of incorporating unions into future processes, right? Robust networks of groups across the world and across this country have already begun refining consensus-based decision-making models and practicing their use every week. Every week, right here in this town, you can find a meeting of the Missoula Tenants Union and practice consensus-based decision-making. We're practicing because it's the cauliflower and the cosmos. This is something that Adrienne Marie Brown says. We have to illustrate on the small level, the cauliflower size level, what is possible on the cosmic level. We have to create a crystalline seed that will replicate into a larger idea. So when these consensus-based decision-making models become the foundation of future decision-making, that's what's going to be happening when we talk about redistribution. Who gets to make those decisions? Who gets to be the decider in those terms? It's all of us. It's all of us as a union. All of us as folks that are in need of housing, because it's a human need. We will become the decision makers of future housing models. There's just so much waste and so much extra in our world. Extra in terms of healthcare, extra in terms of food waste. We talk about incarceration. In America, we imprison almost 700 people per 100,000, the most in the world, by far the most in the world. If we reduced our rate of incarceration even to that of like the evil Chinese, that would be 120 people per 100,000. We spend $182 billion on mass incarceration in this country. What if we were just doing 1/5 of that by imprisoning the same amount of people that the Chinese imprison currently? That frees up a lot of energy, right? I'm reluctant to call it money, but a lot of energy gets freed up. So, as we go to the last slide, housing is a weapon, and right now it's used against us. And when we have housing for all, and we arm the poor with house keys, that means that we are using housing against the injustices in the system. And that's what we need to move towards. I'm excited to get into the conversation part of this and the question part of this, and I want to leave plenty of time for that. So, one more time.
So lastly, we'll return to Mark Anderlich, who will be talking about capitalism and foreign relations. But on the way, first I'd like to, since Josh was just talking about the Missoula Tenants Union, I'd like to make a pitch. Everybody who's a tenant should be part of that. So please do that. And also I'd like to make a pitch for DSA, Western Montana Democratic Socialists of America. Please join us. Our next general meeting is Saturday morning, 11 a.m. at Good Work Ventures on Alder Street. So now, Mark.
Great. Well, this has been excellent, and it's hard to follow up. I'm going to speak briefly about internationalism. And if you're like me, I am sick and tired of these forever wars. I don't know if you know people who have served in the military in Iraq, Afghanistan, they come back broken. And a part of them has died in this. One of the fundamental principles of socialism is called internationalism. This is because capitalism is international. The struggle for socialism must also be international. For example, the socialist struggle in Latin America finds the working class fighting the same corporations and international financial institutions as in the U.S. In a fundamental way, our fates are intertwined here in this country and around the world. As go these neo-colonial institutions, so go our respective socialist movements. Further, the history of socialism in one nation, as in the Stalinist Soviet Union, for example, has not been successful nor very good. Internationalism also means that the U.S. empire will be dismantled. We do have an empire. We've always lived in an empire, and it will need to be dismantled. The current structures of the U.S. empire, such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, transnational corporations, so-called black operations, and U.S. military bases around the world will need to be dismantled. New structures will be created to assist all nations' self-determination and their democratic development. What's good for us is good for other people, right? In practical terms, this means that debts accrued by nations through the neo-colonial structures will be forgiven. The new institutions of international development would operate requiring the values of democratic self-determination, social justice, and the well-being of the most vulnerable citizens of the recipient nation. In a mixed capitalist and socialist world economy, trade between nations will be complex. Negotiated agreements between nations or between groups of nations will be hammered out, with the socialist nations insisting upon trade that does not use exploited labor or that is environmentally unsustainable. And under socialism in the U.S., there will be an explicit acknowledgement of the colonial past, which informs reparations of both internal groups, such as Native Americans and blacks, as has been mentioned, and external groups around the globe, in fact, practically in every country. Truth and reconciliation hearings for all of these instances, with some kind of useful reparations determined through these hearings, will be essential to establish a healthy internationalism. The private property of the transnational corporations and other socialist nations would become the public property of the host communities. As such, there can be a democratic structure that maintains the business internationally as well. Transnational corporate private property in capitalist nations will be tricky to handle, but that transfer could happen in negotiations that require the host nation not to allow oligarchs to capture the businesses. The U.S. empire and its vassal states in Europe and the Pacific Rim operate a whole host of so-called black operations around the world. A socialist U.S. would, as first order of business, defund and dismantle such covert operations and prosecute those responsible for violations of international law. While there is a need for intelligence gathering, such would not violate the democratic self-determination of any nation. Of course, internationalism requires a socialist U.S. to cease arming and supporting in any way nations engaged in war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And I'm speaking about you, Israel, among others. Furthermore, the closure of all military bases around the world will be an opportunity for a socialist U.S. to hand over all non-weapon property to the host community for whatever economic development they can derive from it. This also means that huge numbers of military personnel will be out of a job and will require a just transition to socially productive work. A currency-issuing government can, at minimum, provide for lifetime pensions in exchange for the loss of work. But even better would be the reintegration of military personnel into a civilian socialist economy. A socialist U.S. would also dismantle the massive arms industry, as it currently demands wars. This is where the forever wars come from to generate profits, making it one of the most exploitative of all industries. Once again, dismantling the arms industry would require a just transition for workers to socially productive work, or at least a lifetime pension. Eliminating the military-industrial complex would greatly reduce the chance of war. But it would also free up resources, both human and natural, to build a socially productive economy. While currency-issuing governments are not constrained by a lack of money, they are constrained by a lack of human and natural resources. Freeing these up away from the military-industrial complex will be a huge boon to a socialist economy. Further, a socialist U.S. will rid itself of all weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear, chemical, biological, and other weapons that threaten civilian murder. International agreements to effectively ban these weapons can be reached if the U.S. leads the way in a progressive and verifiable process to dismantle them and the private property used to make them. One might ask, what about national defense? Won't the dismantling of the military-industrial complex allow other nations to threaten us? Well, first of all, the principal military threat to the U.S. today are nuclear weapons. Ridding ourselves of these weapons at the same time the other nuclear weapon states rid themselves of them will greatly enhance U.S. national security. Gone will be the days when every imperialist war terrorizes all of us, our children, and all of you and myself, with threats to the lives of everyone by nuclear weapons. Further, the U.S. is somewhat unique in that our borders are vast oceans, or with countries that are not a threat. If a nation decides to actually invade a socialist U.S., they will need to transport, and this comes from the Pentagon, some of their estimates, at the very least 1 million soldiers to successfully occupy the United States. No nation has the capacity or the means to do this. It's ridiculous. And their supply chains across oceans or from neighboring countries would be long and very vulnerable. An occupying force would not be able to manufacture weapons in a socialist U.S. that has dismantled its military industry, for one. An occupying force would also need to recruit U.S. citizens to its cause and depend on local supplies of food and other essentials to maintain their troops. This all points to huge vulnerabilities of such an occupying force. Vulnerabilities a national defense force can use greatly to its advantage. For example, citizens can hide supplies, disrupt supply chains, fraternize with the troops, undermine support for turncoats, and directly disrupt military operations. All of this and more can be done without weapons or violence. The occupying military will find a socialist U.S. ungovernable and so withdraw. This points to a socialist transformation. Oh, I was just going to say, and will withdraw as the U.S. military was unable to occupy and suppress Afghanistan and had to withdraw. Same difference, but without even necessarily using force. This points to a socialist transformation of defense forces. Social defense would train citizens to use their organized solidarity to repel enemies, both foreign and domestic. The use of disruption, strikes, non-cooperation, etc., as weapons will prove to be more effective and more democratic than the use of guns and bombs. Strategies and tactics will develop in the most effective use of social defense by the citizens participating in such preparations. So in summary, my vision for international relations is a socialist U.S. foreign policy that would include internationalism, a dismantling of the empire both economically and militarily, reparations for past wrongs, a massive reduction, if not elimination, of the military, and a functional and effective replacement of the military with social defense. Thank you.
So thanks for hanging in for all these. And we'll now open this up to a question and answer. I'd just like to say that one of the peace activists during World War I called a bayonet a weapon that has a worker on each end. So we can look at military as that too. So please, let me open up the room to questions. Yeah, here, could somebody move pass this around? So who wants to start? Wants to open things up? Okay.
It seems like very complicated issues. You're presenting a quite a radical change. So there needs to be a plan for how this is accomplished. But I have recently been reading about Cuba and their attempts to become a socialist country. And we have practically crushed them. And I read that the United States has been involved in, is it 140 or more attempts at subversion or coups in the world in the last, say, 100 years, say since 1898. If you have a capitalist country, it will not give up its wealth to the commoners readily. And the capitalists own the funds to destabilize. And now we're in a post-AI world where I recently read now that ICE has been given the capability of using a surveillance software that can get into anybody's phone at any time. And like the Chinese with their retinal imprints and monitoring of cell phones, if more than a couple of people get together, they're aware of it and monitoring it. So I think it's naive in a post-AI world to think that we can resist with older methods of resistance. So I would like you to address that. Thank you.
I'll try. Yes, I'll try to answer that. I would say this, that as an organizer, that I know it's an old one-to-one method, right, where we talk to people on one-to-one level and get people and talk with people who aren't necessarily with us and to try to encourage them to join with whatever plan we have, all right? As long as we can talk with each other on a one-to-one basis, I think we could organize hundreds of thousands of people to take collective action. The other thing is that the capitalists are very vulnerable, and I'll say this: that there was a meme that I posted on my Facebook page about, a worker without a billionaire still has skills and knowledge and a community, but a billionaire without workers can't even operate his own yacht, all right? And I remember hearing stories during COVID of billionaires freaking out and wanting to go, find some haven somewhere, New Zealand or the South Pacific, and that and there's actually, there's an industry here in Montana that arose too of finding sanctuary here, but these people cannot drive the planes themselves. They cannot drive the boats themselves. They cannot. They are dependent upon the working class. So at some point, and this is why things like strikes are so effective. If you're not making if workers aren't working, and I think David really brought this up beautifully about healthcare. If you're not a productive worker able to make profits for the man, then the man considers you expendable, right? But that also means that they are totally dependent upon workers, and they cannot function, they cannot operate as billionaires without workers being supine and slavish in their in their work. And I think we're not to that point yet. We have people who are willing to fight, as we can see with ICE, in the different parts of this country, where people come out in the hundreds to oppose the brown shirts, which that's what ICE is. They're a fascist force. And people are standing up and delegitimizing them greatly. So I think there's a lot of hope that way because, even ICE, even Trump depends on legitimacy. If they're not seen as legitimate, they're going to lose their grip on power rather quickly.
I would just add that the number of billionaires is exceedingly small. It's like a sparsely attended basketball game at the university worth of people. We're talking about less than 3,000 individuals. So that's a piece of the frame that I want to put out there, that there are 8.5 billion of us, and there are 3,000 of them. So you're right. The transition to a post-capitalist world might not be as smooth as we all want it to be, but the people that it will be least smooth for are those 3,000 folks.
I'd also add that there is a lot of success with BDS movements, boycotts, divestment, and sanctioning of companies like Amazon, of Google, Apple, Walmart, trying to remove ourselves from the system as much as we can while we're forced to exist within it. So refusing to give our money to the Israeli lobby or to billionaires if we're able to afford it. And then also creating communities of care where we currently exist. There's a big movement among millennials right now who are trying to go in together with friends and family and invest in land and try and meet our own needs and be as self-sufficient as we possibly can. Like I don't know if I brought this up, but for the majority of human history, we existed as primitive communism, right? So we existed in smaller, more tribal, close-knit communities where we use the resources accessible to us to meet our collective needs. That is the majority of our history as human beings, and we are still able to do that in modern times using the resources and the technology that we have. So there are everyday acts of revolution that don't necessarily mean taking up arms against the military-industrial complex or the police state.
I just, like to your point about how the U.S. has spent massive amounts of energy trying to undermine Cuba, and many other countries around the world. The U.S. is, I would say, is the number one opponent of peace on the planet, and so in some sense, it's our obligation more than any others to change capitalism in this country. Not just for ourselves, which is important, but for the rest of the world too, so we can pull back from hurting the rest of the world. Other questions, comments?
Testing this through my mask. Okay, I don't have a question. I just want to say I found Health Communism free. Less is More, Health Communism, and the patient guide that DQ was talking about. So if anybody wants any of those, come find me. I'll be back here for a little bit.
Other comments, other questions?
I'm sort of curious about the concept of private property. You mentioned distinction between private property and personal property, your CDs. In the UK, they have taken various things that are private and they nationalize them, like railroads. That seems to be more equitable, that more people are involved in controlling something as a great resource. I think a good example of a number of things that you talked to, Mark, was back in '52 when the CIA organized a revolt in Iran because they had nationalized, I think, the railroad and also oil production following Britain. They had a parliament back there in Iran, and they sort of followed the Britain parliament of nationalizing things. And I guess that was a threat to the capitalists to see a country do that. And so they had a black op, CIA organized against that. You could make some comments on that, perhaps.
Yeah, that's a big one. So I would say that is one of the vulnerabilities of socialism, right? Where because because we are trying to build community and be open and try to make decisions together, even in disagreement. Celia did that talked about that brilliantly. That makes us vulnerable to, perhaps other bad actors around the world, right? So, and I'm not sure if your question's about nationalization, but more about how do we resist something like that? And I would say that right now, the U.S. and the West are by far and away the worst actors in the world in terms of black ops and whatnot, and disrupting, as in Cuba, right? The Cuba is still on the socialist path. They're still trying, even despite all of the nonsense that we've visited upon them and all the pain and suffering. They have found a resilience, somehow in developing their socialist community. But that would be something that we'd have to look at. I'd say that if that was shut down in this country, a lot of and U.S. and Britain are probably the two biggest bad players in terms of subversion of socialist organizations in countries around the world. If we were to eliminate, just that in the United States, somehow that would there might be others that pick up and want to go down the same path, but I kind of doubt it actually at this point. That I don't think China or Russia or any other, Brazil, they don't seem to be on that trajectory of wanting to undermine and foment counter-revolution in the United States, right, or elsewhere.
The other part of my question had to do with private property, and
right.
There's been a whole hierarchy of sovereignty and then capitalist private property and moving on down. One of America's greatest ideas, somebody has claimed, is public lands that we all own, national parks, and supposedly that's all ours. One could continue into sort of the indigenous view that there is no such thing as private property. It's all the earth, all mother. So changing our ideas, I think, about who owns what or private property may be part of the transition from capitalism to socialism. Comments?
Yeah, I think you're right. Often you just hear it all the time, like, yeah, socialism can't work because it's going to take. I mean, you hear this about when, as Mamdani won the mayoral election in New York, just the most incredible BS. And one of the things they say, well, yeah, it's going to be a clampdown on human rights and all property is going to be eliminated and blah blah blah. I mean, number one, electing a socialist into office doesn't make New York City a socialist city. Number one, it's a process. These aren't, as everyone has mentioned here, in one way or another. This isn't about individuals. This is about a system, right? And I would say that to overcome that, people need to understand the distinction. That property used to oppress and exploit people, maybe that's the simplest way of talking about private property. And you can transform that property into public property when it doesn't exploit anymore. It doesn't violate people anymore. and then throw in the personal property thing just to counter the argument that they're going to take away your toothbrush. Socialists are going to take away your toothbrushes. It's like, that's nonsense. But that's the arguments, and that's going to have to be dealt with in how we change the system.
In terms of private versus public property and personal possessions versus private property, I mean, when we talk about a system where our needs are met, our material needs are met, what are our needs after our needs are met? Do they come in the form of trinkets and plumage, or are our needs at that moment actually human interactive needs? Right, ballrooms.
So I have a question that kind of goes along with the person that asked the first question. So we all know about maybe the threat of the current administration and their opposition to leftist movements, but also what I've seen is there's been a lot of reactionary violence from non-government actors, the Proud Boys, Three Percenters, groups like this. Like in the wake of Charlie Kirk's assassination, you just had to look online, go on Twitter, and there's people being like, "Now's the time where we're gonna crush the left." So when I see stuff like that, I wonder how. Maybe you can answer this, but I don't believe that nonviolent solidarity or nonviolent resistance can be an adequate defense if, God forbid, civil tensions in this nation turn up more and we see widespread reactionary violence. I think that's not it's not a viable option, because these groups they deny a lot of people their humanity. They deny the basic humanity of a lot of people that they oppose. If you can answer that.
Well, I'll take another crack at that too. So you have to understand that the Proud Boys and et cetera are just appendages to a system, right? They are a creation of authoritarian capitalism, which means that capitalism is losing its mojo, right? If it has to resort to that, it's not confident that it's going to maintain itself. But we have to look at it systematically. It's a system. We can get rid of all the Proud Boys in the world one way or another, and the system is going to remain. There's going to be new Proud Boys, and they're going to be called something different, and they're going to appear somewhere else. So this is not without, I guess it's not without some vulnerability that we have, okay? I mean, what's this, stops a Proud Boy from coming in here, and doing whatever, right? We have to be able to risk being vulnerable to a certain extent. And because in the long run, we have to change the system. It's I think, I forget who mentioned it, but maybe it was David about Luigi, right? That's a great example. There was a lot of popular opinion about Luigi killing the United Healthcare executive, right? But that doesn't change the system. There's more, whatever the guy's name was, there's more of them to fill into that spot. They're just waiting in line, right? So we have to look at this systematically. We have to also be, and I'm not saying self-defense isn't that we shouldn't be, defending ourselves, but the important thing isn't getting rid of the Proud Boys. It's getting rid of the system that creates the Proud Boys.
Yeah, let me take a stab at this one too. A couple things. First, let's remember that Gandhi's Satyagraha movement was able to force out the most brutal empire in history. And let's not forget, the British Empire was one of the most brutal empires in history. You know, they had rivals. You know, some perhaps worse, but they were up there, and all of their brutality didn't help them that much, you know, and they were terrible to Gandhi's people, but they were able to hold on. So nonviolence isn't just an ethical stance; it's a tactical one too. And one of the ways of making sure that our side, whatever you want to call that, is prepared is to take trainings in nonviolence, which both Mark and I run these trainings too. So keep your eyes on the DSA website for whenever we do our next training, and they're all free, by the way. But and there's many examples of this. You know, we can look at the Nazi occupation of Denmark during World War II. Their intention in occupying Denmark was to use Denmark's shipbuilding facilities to build warships. And because of the various aspects of nonviolent resistance that they did within Denmark, not a single ship was built during the Nazi occupation. So these are things that, as nonviolent people, we can be proud of. And then just to go back to your question again earlier, you were pointing out that there's all these new tools that the corporate world and the government world have, things like AI and things like that. And what that means is partly we need to be more creative. We need to be absolutely understanding the situation we find ourselves in, and not to be fighting the last war next time. But that's what generals do. But we can tend to say, even though they have this latest technology, they're not necessarily all that bright about using it. And so we can use that technology, or we can use our wit, we can use our creativity to counteract that. But we have to be creative. We can't just give up and say, well, they've got all these weapons to use against us. We can't just give up and say they've got this will to use it against us. But we have to say, yes, we will be able to prevail. We will prevail. We are the 99%. We are the vast majority. We can do it.
Yeah, the last thing I'll add, thanks for the question, thanks for everyone who's sticking around here, is one of the things I think from maybe the most famous socialists among us, was Martin Luther King Jr. The thing that I kind of appreciated about him most was teaching me that pacifism wasn't just lying prostrate while someone abused me or whatever, but it was an actual state of mind. And what we're building, we don't have to veer from the path. And I think I want to give you some of your power back. And anybody who's worried about violence and matching violence with violence, is that we're incurring violence every day. And we need to understand violence like we need to understand racism and sexism and any bigotry. It's not always, some turd in a Ku Klux Klan outfit oppressing someone on the street, right? Like racism can come in so many forms since it's systemic. And I think same with violence. So you yourself, we've had the comrades tell you every which way we're getting abused and exploited. You're persevering right now in this moment, and you're persevering and you're living this life despite all that. And so the things that we focus on when we build and not worry about, playing shoot 'em up with some gamer in the street, or whatever it looks like for you. I know the threat's real because a lot of these people love gun culture. But one thing I really resent on the left is what I call guillotine culture. And people will romanticize the French Revolution or these other, but I guess the last thing I have so many thoughts on this, is go back to Sister Hannah Arendt, right? When she wrote Eichmann in Jerusalem, when all these Nazis fled to Argentina and South America, we had a chance to do something really revolutionary with Eichmann, something restorative, like a lot of these Nazi generals, and we just killed him. And we did nothing with his life. He never lived to learn. So I think we can focus on what we can do, what we can build, keep pushing forward. The Civil War is a fantasy for a lot of these people, because they're like one of these brilliant minds said, you know, a lot of these people who buy into this violent philosophy are getting played the hardest, right? Our cops, our military, they're preyed upon and they're brought into these systems oftentimes with no other choice, right? Here's college, right? Here's a debt relief. So we don't have to match that. I think we can learn from people who came before us and ourselves every day, right? The resistance is in your body, it's in your blood, and you're fighting back against it. And maybe you have a gun on you, but I don't think you do. I think you have a really big weapon. I think we all do.
I'm going to be the odd man out here for a second. Almost every single successful revolution in the history of human civilization has had some level of an armed resistance that contributed to success of that resistance. That does not mean that every single individual needs to take up arms. There's a time and place for it, and as socialists, we should never be the ones perpetuating violence, but we will be met with violence every single step of the way when trying to take the means of production and the wealth and the power away from those who own the means of all of that power and wealth. And so there are local organizations such as the Clark Fork Gun Club that exists. There's also the Socialist Rifle Association that exist, to be in community with like-minded people who have genuine and valid concerns that we will be met with violence, and we want to be able to respond to protect ourselves and our communities. And there is room for people to take up arms in the resistance and the revolution, but that does not mean everybody has to. So I just wanted to add that.
I'm with Justice that it's a multiplicity of tactics, but I would also say, like, what do you call a white nationalist whose needs are met? Who that precarity has been lifted off of them. Maybe you call them your neighbor, or something like that. But the person that would commit violence against you is also a victim of capitalism, and so and the violence that exists in our society is not primarily person-to-person violence. It is system-to-worker violence, and that violence exists on large scales, just oceans full of that type of violence, comparatively to the individual person-to-person violence that we might see.
And I'm sorry to be such a blowhard, but I'll just say one more thing, then we'll take perhaps one more question if we have time. Does anybody here remember who John Trudell was? He was one of the leaders of the American Indian movement in the 1960s and 70s. At some point, he was warned that if he went to give a talk someplace, that his family would be murdered. And indeed, someone firebombed his home, killed his 4 children, his wife, and his father-in-law. And when he was asked years later, did the FBI murder your family? He said, don't know if they did. But they made it an atmosphere in which it was acceptable for someone to do that. And so the pacifist response to something like that would be to know your neighbors. It's like you can hear lots of people going around talking about, like, oh, I hate all these, whatever it is, fill in the blanks. I hate all these lefties, union people and stuff. But Mark here, you're my buddy. I would never hurt you. You're my friend here. I'm going to kill every union person I see. Right? It's a contradiction. But when we humanize ourselves to other people, they rehumanize themselves to us. And we should make that a point of getting to know our neighbors, no matter how right-wing, however MAGA, whatever they appear to be, because at the end, they're still our neighbors. And so I guess one more question, and then we'll call it a night. Anything else?
Okay, y'all have kind of already answered this, but I was curious. especially as like a trans brown woman of color, how do we handle like the culture war? Do you know what I mean? Like there are people who are like viciously racist, who are viciously sexist, who do want to kill all trans people, who have never met trans people. I have had to use my like hands on the street. Do you know what I mean? Because people like will come at me because I'm like a visibly like genderqueer person. So how do we handle culture war? Because y'all have been saying like we need to like make room for dissent, which I completely agree with, and like we are like there are 8.5 billion of us, which is absolutely true. But some of these people like just are not our allies. Do you know what I mean? So how do we tell when someone is like our ally and when somebody is actually standing in solidarity with us in a way that is like material and like actually functional, versus like when we need to like protect our own. Do you know what I'm saying?
Wants to.
Well, I don't have all the answers. I appreciate this question. I appreciate you being vulnerable, asking this and putting this out there. I think I think we really need to learn what safety means from targeted communities. And the last slide I put up on my, I wasn't paying attention. The adrenaline was flowing. But at the bottom I put, join one of the groups I big upped, and the most vulnerable among you, the people incurring the most violence, systemic or whatever, are what we call the vanguard. And so that means at the center of all the planning, at the center of the direction the group moves, what safety looks like, what success looks like, what solidarity looks like. It's a verb, just like our sister Celia said, we is. It's actually showing up in the ways that we understand from you, right? So I would never tell you, wait, hold on, Martin Luther King said, while you're getting beat up in the street, right? And I'm never going to tell that family, well, hold on, have you tried dialogue after your family was burned? And, but I think it's, I don't have any big answers for you other than it's time to listen to trans people. It's time to listen to people of color. It's time to listen to people with disabilities, learn and be directed by, right? And plan with. Other than that, I'll keep hitting the gym. And every time we're walking around, you can count on me to throw down with some of these bigots in the street. But I think we just have to listen and learn, because the reason why you're asking that means that we haven't yet.
Real is right. Oof. The example that trans people set is the example of the most honest humanity and the most free person that can exist. This is why it's so scary to people that would oppress us. The concept of that kind of unlimited freedom is anathema to everything that capitalism represents. And like David said, you're our vanguard for those ideas. And every collective space that's making any kind of decision needs to inform that decision with the most vulnerable and the most free amongst them.
Okay. So thank you everybody for coming this evening. Another hand for our panel. And please join us. Come join DSA. We're having our next monthly meeting on this Saturday, November 8th at 11 a.m. at Good Works Place, and on Alder Street. And join the Missoula Tenants Union and join the revolution.
And
we'll see you next time.
And also, if you're interested in joining our newsletter, if you're not already part of it, we have a sign up here along with a bunch of literature, and we also have shirts for sale if you want to rep. So yeah.
Thank you. And have a good evening, everybody.